First to the Gambia, where supporters of the incumbent president, Adama Barrow, have been celebrating in the capital, Banjul, and elsewhere in the country. That's because he's been re-elected in a vote which was seen as a test of the country's democratic transition. 5 years ago, Mr. Barrow defeated the long-standing military ruler, Yahya Jammeh. This time, Mr. Barrow received around 53% of the vote, with his nearest rival, Usaini Darboe, on 28%. Well, now Mr. Darboe and other candidates have been querying the results, citing delays and unspecified irregularities in the count.
I say a big thank you to all the electors who turned out to cast their votes for exercising their franchise. One of the most important civic duties of a citizen. I also thank my co-contenders of the presidency for their endurance and tough times on matters of concern, because without them, there wouldn't have been any race. I call on all Gambians, irrespective of our political divide, to put aside our political and other differences and come together as one people to work towards the development of our country. I thank you. Oh, my God bless you.
That's the winner of that ballot, the man who is, of course, the incumbent president in Gambia, Adama Barrow. Well, for more on the Gambian elections and the results, I'm joined now on the line from London by the director of the Royal African Society, Dr. Nicholas Westcott. Great to see you, Dr. Westcott. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. 53 against 28 seems very conclusive, doesn't it? I mean, how unhappy are the opposition with the result?
Well, thank you, Charles. Yes, ostensibly, at first glance, this looks like a very good news story for democracy out of Africa. Following on from the Malawi elections last year, the Zambian elections earlier this year, the return of a Democrat. The elections took place, the opposition were allowed to run, they weren't arrested, they weren't thrown into prison, there wasn't a great deal of violence. So it appears to have been a reasonably open, fair, democratic election. But there's a bit more history to this than perhaps meets the eye. The election success of Adama Barrow in 2017 against former President Yahya Jammeh was a surprise. And Jammeh was not expecting to lose. The election was perhaps a little more open and free and fair than he had expected, but he was eventually persuaded to accept the outcome of the election. And Adama Barrow, who came in as a sort of compromise candidate for an opposition coalition, and he had come out of the UDP to lead that coalition, said before the elections that he would just do 3 years and then he would step down and be another election. And when the time came, he decided that he really ought to serve out the full 5 years of the presidential mandate. And then he decided that actually he should stand again and formed himself a new party to back him in 2019. And his former allies in the UDP were rather disappointed. And the runner-up, as you mentioned, Usaini Darboe of the UDP, came in second. So actually stood against their former member, Adama Barrow. So it's a little more complicated than that. In terms of how the elections ran, I haven't been able to find yet any report from observer missions. I think there were not many international observer missions, but there were some local election observers, and I haven't yet seen reports from independent authorities. But as you say, the opposition have said they believe there have been irregularities, the vote came out too quickly, it was a bit suspicious, they're not sure about the tallies at some of the polling stations. So there are complaints. It would be surprising if there were none, but those complaints should be addressed by the judiciary, and the judiciary are one of the institutions that Adama Barrow has tried to reform, because they had not been as independent under Yahya Jammeh as perhaps would be expected. And it was part of his reforms to allow the judiciary to be more independent. We'll see what their judgment is on any legal complaints that are brought against. But at first glance, as I say, this appears to have been a free and fair election, even if it's understandable that some people are unhappy with it, particularly because Adama Barrow appears to be deciding that he quite likes the idea of remaining president rather than stepping down and allowing somebody else to run.
Well, thank you very much indeed for setting that out as lucidly and as clearly as you have, as well as giving us a bit of background there. So I suppose that the next question is, given the things that you have said, Dr. Westcott, I mean, the fact that Adama Barrow came in, said he would spend 3 years, then decided he wasn't going to leave, and then, went for a second term. I mean, how is it that he did so well? Because, I mean, we've heard a lot about the deep political divisions in Gambia. I mean, there are still many supporters, as you touched on there, of the former leader Yahya Jammeh as well. I mean, what do you think won the votes for Mr. Barrow?
That's a very good question, Charles. And it highlights the difficulty for some Democrats of following on from an autocratic president. And I'm afraid Yahya Jammeh, as has been evidenced quite a lot in public, was quite an authoritarian figure, and certainly came to power in a coup, changed the constitution on a regular basis to enable himself to stay in power. He was not a model Democrat. And following on from that is quite difficult because there are two challenges. One, the office of president itself has been slightly called into question, that it can be abused. Secondly, there's a big demand for justice and reconciliation. And there has been a Justice and Reconciliation Commission meeting to try and address the transgressions of the past under the Jammeh regime. And Jammeh himself remains in exile. He's not particularly welcome back. So there are still divisions. The country was not united. President Jammeh did have voters who supported him. And Adama Barrow appears to have decided that if he's to stay on, he has to hold out a hand of friendship to some of Jammeh's former supporters. And in 2019, when he set up his own party and in the run-up to the elections, he seemed to form an alliance with some of the residual Jammehists. And although Yahya Jammeh himself supported one of the other candidates who came in third, that was the Mama Kande candidate. So Jammeh himself was not supporting Barrow, but Barrow had clearly appealed to some of the Jammeh supporters to back him, and as I say, had actually fallen out with some of his traditional supporters in the UDP, traditionally the opposition party. So it was quite a complicated arithmetic, and he probably considered, what is the best way I can win a majority? If I stand opposed by the UDP and opposing the Jammeh party, I might well lose this election. So I need to represent a wider constituency. And the results would suggest that he has been successful in that. But obviously that won't be popular with everybody, particularly those who are trying to bring the transgressors of the Jammeh regime to justice. And there was a little controversy because he has not yet published the commission report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And therefore people are saying, what's going on here? Is he really going to address the problems of the past? But there's a second reason, and that is that he has actually achieved some of the things he said he would. Not all of them, but, and the country has suffered very severely from the repercussions of the COVID pandemic, because Gambia, as you know, relies very heavily on tourism, and that was cut out almost completely. Even peanut exports have been badly affected. So the country's had hard times, but Barrow has delivered on some of his promises. One of his commitments was to reform the constitution, and a constitutional commission was set up and did produce a report. But this failed to secure the 75% majority in Parliament when it was brought to a vote earlier this year, I think, or last year, September last year. And that is an interesting question as to who opposed this reformed constitution. And a lot of the argument was about whether, if Adama Barrow chose to run again, this second election would count as his second term in office, or his first term in office under the new constitution. And some supporters of Adama Barrow said, no, it should, the term before the constitution was amended should not count. And the two-term limit should begin from when the constitution comes into force, and voted it down. So he's not been able to reform the constitution. And that too has given some legs to the opposition, who are a little sceptical about what's going on. But Jammeh appears to have pulled together a coalition that has given him sufficient political support, even if not universal. But that's what happens in a democracy.
Well, absolutely. And we've got less than a minute before we end this segment of the chat. I mean, you mentioned the fact that there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and obviously that commission focused largely on the alleged atrocities committed during Yahya Jammeh's 20-year rule. I mean, how might the result of this election determine what happens to Yahya Jammeh next? And we've got about 30 seconds.
I think it's unlikely that Jammeh will be welcomed back as long as Barrow is president. But the report of the commission may not have helped secure for Adama Barrow the support of Jammeh's supporters who remain in the country. So he had a tricky decision. But nevertheless, it will be important, I think, for this process to have its impact, for that commission report to be published, because people need to see that justice is done.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. Dr. Westcott, please stay with us. We're going to come right back and talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the director of the Royal African Society, Dr. Nicholas Westcott. We'll get his perspective on Nigeria joining the countries on the UK's COVID red list. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, Nigeria has joined 10 other African nations on the UK's coronavirus red list that requires travellers who are British or Irish nationals who wish to enter to quarantine for 10 days after they arrive in the UK, a move which isn't cheap. It comes with a hotel bill of around $3,000. Now that's if you've got a British or an Irish passport. If you don't, you can't come. The British government says the restrictions are necessary because Nigeria is now only second to South Africa in terms of linked cases to the Omicron COVID mutations. Now, as you may know, there have been many people from the WHO to scientists who are saying that travel restrictions are an overreaction and actually it's too late because Omicron is already out there.
Recent days, we have learned of a significant number of growing cases linked to travel with Nigeria. There are 27 cases already in England, and that's growing. And Nigeria now is second only to South Africa in terms of linked cases to Omicron. So today, the government has decided to add Nigeria to the travel red list, and that will be effective from 4 a.m. on Monday, which will mean that only UK citizens or residents of the UK can enter the UK from Nigeria from that point onwards, and they will have to quarantine in one of the relevant hotels. We've kept the data under review over the last week or so since we learnt about Omicron, and we're seeing increasing number of cases linked to travel. And again, we've always said we will act swiftly if we need to, if the changing data requires that, and that's why we've decided to bring in this change on pre-departure tests. Now, I will stress these are temporary measures. We want to remove them as soon as we possibly can, but before we learn more about Omicron, it is right that we have these measures in place.
That's Sajid Javid, who is the UK's Health Secretary, and Dr. Nicholas Westcott, Director of the Royal African Society, is still with me on the line from London. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us, Dr. Westcott. What's your reaction to the travel ban imposed on Nigeria? Is it justified, or do you think it is arrogance or ignorance or overreaction on the part of the UK?
I think the travel ban on Nigeria has come as a real shock because throughout the COVID crisis up until now, Nigeria has been relatively little affected by COVID and has never gone on the red list before. So this is a complete turnabout in British policy in relation to Nigeria, and the overall level of infections, COVID infections in Nigeria, is still very low, far lower than in the UK. But the government, as you just heard, have signalled that they are very worried about the Omicron variant, and that there are some cases that are coming from Nigeria, usually originating in South Africa, Nigeria coming into the UK, and they feel they have to take every step possible to oppose this, to stop the incoming cases. As has been pointed out, there are cases of Omicron already in the UK. We can't put up an iron barrier. It's already here and it will inevitably spread. But they're saying we need to slow it down because we need to find out what this variant is like, how seriously we must take it, if it's more fatal, what's the best treatment to avoid it spreading. And they have imposed some domestic measures here, much wider wearing of face masks. So this is only one part of their strategy. And it's a strategy driven by the fact that this government was accused of cancelling Christmas last year by not responding quickly enough to an accelerating rate of infections and having to make a change right at the last minute, just as everybody had bought the turkey, invited the friends, and then they said, no, only 6 people around the table. And they are terrified, the government, of having to cancel Christmas again this year. Now, you can't cancel Christmas, but what they mean is the social activities that traditionally go along with that. And therefore, they are taking what might in other circumstances be considered unreasonable precautions in trying to show the public that they're doing everything they can to stop the spread of Omicron variant and try and keep the level of infections no worse here than it is. And it's still running very high here. You have 40,000 cases a day. You have 100 to 200 people dying a day. The COVID crisis is by no means over in the UK. And the government has been bitten before by acting too little, too late. And this time they are going overboard, and some would say doing too much, too soon.
Yes, I mean, that's, I think the line you mentioned, or the suggestion under what you're saying really is that there is a strong political element to all of this. And some have argued that beyond being an overreaction on the part of Britain, that if there is going to be a travel ban, I mean, there should be equity in it. I mean, there is Omicron all over Europe, but travel bans have not been imposed on those countries, have they?
Put your finger on the presentational problem, that basically Africa is a cheap target for the government to show it's being tough. Because there is relatively less travel to and from Africa. For the African countries concerned, South Africa already protested strongly against being put back on the red list just in the middle of their tourist season. And Nigeria too, there's a huge amount of travel to and from Britain and Nigeria at all times of year, but especially around Christmas, which is travel that's good for both countries normally. And it appears what the UN Secretary General has referred to as travel apartheid, which the Nigerian High Commissioner himself referred to on radio this morning in the UK, saying it appears that there is one rule for some, Africa, and a different rule for others, Europe. And it's hard to deny that on the scientific evidence. There are no more cases coming in from Nigeria than there probably are from some other European countries. Mr. Sajid Javid, the health secretary, seems to think otherwise, but it's very hard to know because the source of origin for a lot of these Omicron cases is not always clear. So that there is justified concern that Africa is being discriminated against, and the government is not really addressing that. And it should do, because it's damaging the country's reputation in Africa and our relations with a number of African countries.
No, yeah, you certainly have a point there. So in those circumstances, Dr. Westcott, I mean, would Nigeria be justified in imposing a travel ban the other way? Because, I mean, there are only about 24 or so identified Omicron cases in Nigeria, but there are almost 300 and rising in the UK. We've got about a minute.
Yes. The answer is they would be entirely justified if they applied the same criteria as the UK in imposing a travel ban. But there would be a cost to Nigeria for doing that as well, because it would discourage visitors coming from the UK to Nigeria for Christmas. The problem for those travellers is getting back to the UK afterwards. So it would not be a cost-free option for the Nigerian government, even if it might be feel an equitable way. And a lot of the people coming back from Britain to Nigeria around this time of year are Nigerians or people of Nigerian origin to see their families. So it wouldn't necessarily be that popular with their own communities.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's been a really lovely, interesting chat, getting your take on these things, Dr. Westcott. And I hope you'll come back and talk with us again, because it's always brilliant tapping your brain and getting your analysis of these important things that affect Africa. Dr. Nicholas Westcott is, of course, the director of the Royal African Society, and he was talking to me there from London.